Hello, in this video, I definitely wanted to continue on with the series that I've been doing on Baudrillard so far. As an introduction to the series that I'll be doing, talking about a lot of different authors from various philosophical backgrounds and from different perspectives on postmodernism. I am really enjoying doing this series because I feel like it allows me to really dive in depth with a lot of different ways to talk about the different uses of these authors and how they're kind of deployed in different context. And I think that this is another video that I'll really kind of enjoy doing because it's one that I haven't really done anything similar to. I want to talk about Baudrillard on the negative versus critical teams, and I want to talk about the ways that I think Baudrillard teams can execute the different uses of Baudrillard against critical teams on the negative. I think that this a strategy that uses Baudrillard on the negative can be very effective. I think if it makes a critique that allows you to really generate a distinction between form and content, which is a big thing that I'll kind of talk about in this section of this video that I'll be doing next. So I'm talking about really the best form of what I think Baudrillard looks like against K teams. But in general, I think that this video is really meant to go along with a lot of the other videos that I've done, just generally talking about my thoughts on Baudrillard in ways that I think can be both better answered and executed, and just my general thoughts on what some of the key points of focus are. And I think that you should always be tuning into kind of the videos that led up to this because they all give you more context into things that I probably won't be going super in depth on in this video. Just like this video will kind of go in depth on some concepts or ideas from Baudrillard that aren't as emphasized in other videos or thoroughly explained. And so all these videos kind of play a role in really trying to get and understand how this author's arguments operate in different standpoints and maybe what some of the focal points are. I think that when thinking about what the best form of Baudrillard versus critical teams look like, you should definitely be thinking a lot of something closer to the Academy K. I would definitely go look at some of the arguments that I've talked about in the context of the Academy K and some of the other videos that I've done leading up to this. But I definitely think if this is your first time kind of hearing me talk about the Academy K, what I mean by that is that I think that a lot of the arguments that Baudrillard is making about representation and the distinction that a lot of Baudrillard arguments really make between form and content, I think are really integral to the arguments that you want to make against K teams. I think some of the better arguments that can be used to kind of like outframe some of the substance of the criticism, especially against various critical affirmatives where you might not be good as talking about on the example basis, and really just kind of forward a way of thinking about the debate that pushes us to think about the role that different types of study and different types of scholarship play in debate and their ability to create politics outside of the debate. When I'm talking about the form-content distinction, what I mean is that Baudrillard, a lot of arguments that are made in Baudrillard's argument against the Academy is that although the Academy may kind of allow the presence of, for instance, like what is deemed as like radical scholarship or something that either critiques the Academy society, something that attempts to be like outside to the kind of like normative ways that study is forwarded, or in the way that that's incorporated into the Academy. Baudrillard's argument is that that does not actually change the form or the structure of what the Academy does as a particular presence for subsuming how the representation translates into actual change within society. And so the reason why form and content are particularly important terms for understanding this is because form kind of represents like a frame of a picture, right? And the content is kind of everything that's within that picture. And what I think a lot of the arguments that you're kind of pushing towards making when you're trying to apply this type of arguments is trying to say that the frame makes it so regardless of what is within the picture, there's a particular limitation to the ability of the picture to actually represent the populations that it is attempting to speak to, or the structure that it is attempting to critique. And it is there are also many barriers to the ability of that to transition into a type of practice that actually changes the functioning of these systems. And so I kind of want to translate that into how I think it applies to different portions of the flow, and then maybe talk about different ways that you can generate arguments using some of these distinctions and arguments that you can kind of definitely see in various writings that Baudrillard has in places like the means of production, and that I think are particularly important for how you're debating K teams with these arguments. So first, on the framing page, I think that when thinking about the framing page for this debate, it is extremely important to ask the question of how you want the judge to evaluate the debate. A lot of the question that you want to ask about this is not really about the actions of the AF, but about the limitations of how the AF is presented and the way in which the AF is supposed to assuage a particular recognition of presentation in order to like make itself effective. And so I think that you need to create a framing argument that does not allow the other team to like weigh the entirety of like their performance or the way in which they attempt to forward a kind of like a materialization of their study, because by doing so you're already putting yourself in like a place of examples that that kind of like hurt you, and you really want to make arguments that are similar to ones that you're making as policy teams in terms of the limitations of debate. But I think that in the context of Baudrillard, there are a lot more arguments to make about just how the kind of context of like making things matter through the process of suffering, or making arguments or things that are justified via the ability to depict suffering, requires us to like frame our investments in debate through the presentation of that suffering, which requires its existence, right? Like we cannot justify the creation of a better world without the continual violence that happens in the one that we currently exist in. And the idea that a critique is able to like get beyond that is like not represented via like, you know, the examples that are available on how like debate actually transitions into politics and things outside of itself. And so I think there are ways that you want to push a set of framing arguments that really make that set of examples really strong, and makes it really possible for you to really pivot on a way of evaluating the debate that goes outside of it, and like allows you to win that if there's this kind of like structural uniqueness question that overwhelms the ability for the criticism to actually manifest itself, and there's a good reason for there being presumption, because the arguments that they're making in terms of why their like criticism matters in the first place are in the context of their ability to justify them via like various sources of representation, or ways that attempt to make debate transition into a source of politics that I think you can start off as like a place of critique. And I think that that kind of lends itself to the question of like the form of debate as a limit to the content of like the actual radicality of the 1AC, right? And so then when you transition this to questions that you may have about the thesis portion of the debate, I think that when you're debating the thesis portion of the debate, it's incredibly important to win a lot of the arguments that obviously you generally want to go for, in terms of making arguments about the ways in which signs and signifiers have kind of become overrepresented and make it impossible for us to actually understand the like actual like importance or signification of like certain forms of representation. But I also think that you need to make arguments about the kinds of like presentation and imagination of like new worlds, or the ability to create a kind of like new way of thinking, requires us to still invest in the like particular form of like violence that like we've kind of like been seduced in via the form of like the Academy of Debate itself. I think a lot of the arguments that you really want to make is that the idea that there is this kind of like way of being able to like critique the university without like still being part and parcel of the university, the ability to write, to like generate like capital off of like what you write as like a means of survival, the ability to like all of these things to be motivated by a relationship to both capital and to the ways in which we create certain forms of thinking and understanding the world through various signs and signifiers that are forwarded through various forms of study. The way that study sends off a certain affective attachment of an inclusive type of university that doesn't actually translate into these things actually manifesting as material changes for like the communities that are being represented. And hopefully these are kind of the places where you're really like starting your questions that you want to ask for these Baudrillard teams kind of later on in the debate. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll keep tuning into the next part for when I do the second part of this video.